What was the true cost, measured in blood, sweat, strategic blunders, and political gambles, of the fall of one of the most powerful empires of the New World?
In the mid-16th century, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, stood as the pinnacle of Mesoamerican civilization.
This city, built on water, seemed impregnable and eternal. Yet in just a few months, it lay in ruins, and a once fearsome people were conquered by a handful of outsiders.
We will examine not just a chronicle of battles, but the dynamics of mounting pressure and the strategic decisions that led to the catastrophe.
Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a single strategic move by Cortés, one that many would have considered insane, sealed the fate of an entire civilization. I'll reveal this by chance, but to understand the fall of an empire, you need to see it at the height of its power. In 1519, Tenochtitlan was larger than most European capitals and had hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. It was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by massive dams. The streets were a network of canals through which thousands of canoes scurried. Governing such a city required colossal resources and strict organization. This system seemed unshakable, but it harbored a fundamental vulnerability. The Aztec Empire was built not on loyalty, but on fear and tribute. Moctezuma II ruled over vast territories, collecting resources from hundreds of subordinate city-states. Gold, precious stones, food, and, most importantly, people for sacrifice flowed into Tenochtitlan.
This system created the appearance of power, but accumulated immense internal tension.
The conquered peoples hated their oppressors. The empire's political structure was highly centralized. All decisions were made by the great Tlatoani, Moctezuma, who was regarded as nearly divine. When the Spaniards arrived in Veracruz, the system was forced to respond to an unprecedented challenge. This reaction was neither swift nor straightforward. Moctezuma likely saw in Cortés the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy regarding the return of the god Quetzalcoatl. This religious uncertainty paralyzed the Aztec leader's will at the most critical moment. The initial contacts between Cortés and Moctezuma were a mixture of diplomacy and a show of force. The Spaniards sought to reach Tenochtitlan, while the Aztecs tried to stop them with gifts and negotiations. Moctezuma wanted to avoid direct conflict, likely hoping to bribe the newcomers. This was his first fundamental strategic mistake. The gold only fueled Cortés's ambitions and revealed the empire's wealth. Upon arriving in Mesoamerica, Cortés immediately recognized the empire's internal weakness. He launched an active diplomatic campaign, offering the subject peoples liberation from Aztec rule. This decision changed the scale of the threat. The Spaniards ceased to be merely a band of mercenaries. They became the catalyst for a region-wide uprising, rallying Moctezuma's enemies around them. The situation grew more tense with every step Cortés took toward the capital.
Moctezuma, trapped in his political and religious dilemma, failed to take decisive action to destroy the invaders on the outskirts of the city.
By the time Cortés reached the gates of Tenochtitlan, he already had a massive allied army. The Aztecs, accustomed to total control, suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemies led by foreigners. This was the beginning of the end. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Moctezuma's indecision was caused solely by religious reasons, or was it a lack of political will? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the continuation of this gripping story. What you've never seen before isn't the sight of Tenochtitlan itself, but the Aztecs' reaction to the Spaniards when they entered the city. The Spaniards were stunned by the splendor they witnessed. The streets were clean, and the causeways connecting the city to the mainland were an engineering marvel. Majestic pyramid temples rose in the city center. But Cortés saw not only wealth, but also a strategic trap. The Aztecs, although they had let the Spaniards into the city, understood that they were now in control of the situation. They had an overwhelming numerical advantage. The Spaniards were confined to the palace of Ahuyacaatl. Moctezuma II, continuing his policy of appeasement, provided them with everything they needed. This situation could not last long. Cortés' ambitions were not limited to gifts. He wanted complete control over the empire. His strategic decision was to capture Moctezuma II in his own palace. It was a bold and risky move that paralyzed the Aztec system of government. Cortés declared Moctezuma a hostage, but allowed him to continue ruling the state, though now under Spanish control.
Control over Moctezuma gave Cortés the appearance of legitimacy. But this decision had a downside.
The Aztecs quickly realized that their Tlatoani had become a puppet. This undermined Moctezuma's authority and intensified anti-Spanish sentiment in the city. Internal pressure on the Spaniards grew with each passing day. The situation in Tenochtitlan was becoming increasingly tense. Cortés, realizing the danger, tried to strengthen his position. He forced Moctezuma to swear allegiance to the Spanish crown. This decision only deepened the crisis. The Aztecs were furious at their Tlatoani's betrayal. They began secretly gathering forces for an uprising. Tensions in the city reached a peak during the festival in honor of the god Tezcatl. Cortés, who was outside the city, left Pedro de Alvarado in command of the garrison. Alvarado, fearing an uprising, ordered an attack on the unarmed Aztecs during the ceremony.
This decision was a catastrophic mistake that provoked an open rebellion.
The Aztecs rose up, surrounding the palace where the Spaniards were hiding. I'd love to hear your perspective. Please share your thoughts on how Cortés's decision to capture Moctezuma ultimately backfired on him. Write about it in the comments. Ready to learn more details about how they had to escape this trap in the next chapter? Are you ready for the shocking truth about how a handful of surviving Europeans, having lost everything, became the founders of a new empire? La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night, on June 30th, 1520, marked the moment of total collapse for Cortés. The Spaniards were trapped in the palace in Tenochtitlan, without food or water, surrounded by enraged Aztecs. The only way out was to flee. Cortés's strategic decision was risky. He planned to break through the western dam under cover of darkness. The dam had been destroyed, so the Spaniards built a temporary bridge. The Aztecs, using their numerical superiority and knowledge of the terrain, attacked the Spaniards from canoes. The rain and darkness only added to the chaos. The situation was catastrophic. The Spaniards, weighed down by the gold they had so eagerly sought to capture, were drowning in the canal. Horses fell into the water, blocking the passage. The Aztecs used their bows and spears, inflicting heavy casualties.
It was not merely a retreat. It was a massacre.
Cortés, though he survived, lost most of his army that night. Almost all the cannons, horses, and, most importantly, Moctezuma's colossal treasures were lost. Cortés's ambitions were completely shattered, and his power seemed ephemeral. It was a moment of total collapse, after which the stakes became the highest. In this situation, Cortés's survival depended on the help of his allies. The Spaniards reached Tlaxcala, where they were forced to ask their allies for help. Tlaxcala's loyalty was critically important. The Tlaxcalans, seeing a weakened but surviving leader, decided to continue supporting the Spaniards in their struggle against the Aztecs. La Noche Triste did more than just weaken Cortés. It changed the situation in the region. The conquered peoples saw that the Spaniards were vulnerable and could be defeated. Tlaxcala's decision to maintain its alliance with Cortés became a turning point that set off further events. In Tlaxcala, Cortés began planning a new campaign against Tenochtitlan. He realized that the scale of the threat had changed, and he could not rely solely on his own forces. His ambitions were restored, but now they were more realistic.
He began assembling a new army, training soldiers, and building a fleet.
And in the next chapter, you'll learn how they returned to the city with a completely new plan. Thanks for watching. Do you agree that Tlaxcala was a key factor in Cortés's survival? Let us know in the comments.
Pull harder! Move it!
Keep the pace, we haven't got all day.
The hidden code that changes everything isn't an Aztec prophecy, but Cortés's logistics when he returned to Tenochtitlan. After La Noche Triste, Cortés realized that the causeways were not just roads, but strategic choke points, control of which meant control of the city. His ambition was not simply to return, but to completely isolate the capital. This decision changed the nature of the war. While in Tlaxcala, Cortés began actively preparing for a new siege. He understood that Tenochtitlan was impregnable from land. His unique engineering solution was to build a fleet of 13 brigantines that could control Lake Texcoco. This was an unprecedented step in the history of the conquest of the Americas, one that many would have considered insane. Building the brigantines was a colossal undertaking. Thousands of Cortés' Native American allies participated in this project, carrying materials for the ships over the mountains. This decision demonstrated that Cortés was not merely a military leader, but a strategist capable of coordinating vast resources. Control of the situation was gradually returning to his hands. The Aztecs had a new Tlatoani, Cuauhtémoc, who understood the scale of the threat. He tried to fortify Tenochtitlan by gathering allies and resources. Cuauhtémoc knew that Cortés would return, and he was prepared for a long and brutal struggle. But this decision by the Aztecs to focus on defending the dams proved to be their fundamental mistake. Cortés, with his fleet and army, began to act systematically. He captured the cities along the shores of Lake Texcoco that were subject to Tenochtitlan. This decision shifted the balance of power in the region. Cortés wasn't just attacking the Aztecs, he was dismantling their empire inch by inch, depriving them of resources and allies. The situation around Tenochtitlan was heating up. Cuauhtémoc, trapped in his capital, was cut off from the outside world. His vulnerability was becoming increasingly apparent. The first signs of food and water shortages began to appear in the city. The pressure on the Aztecs grew with each passing day. Cortés, with his fleet and army, was ready for the final assault. His strategic decision was to besiege the city from 3 directions, controlling the dams. This decision paralyzed Tenochtitlan. The city, once the pinnacle of civilization, had turned into a besieged fortress. But knowledge of the terrain was only half the battle. Cuauhtémoc had a trump card up his sleeve, and in the next chapter, you'll learn what happened when Cortés finally decided to attack the city. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how the Aztecs used urban architecture? The information worth millions isn't the Aztecs' gold, but Cortés' strategy when he finally began the siege of Tenochtitlan in May 1521. First, Cortés blocked all 3 causeways connecting the city to the mainland. Brigantines patrolled Lake Texcoco, intercepting canoes carrying supplies. The siege of Tenochtitlan began not with a decisive assault, but with a gradual strangulation. Cortés divided his forces into 3 detachments under the command of his most trusted officers. Each detachment was to attack Tenochtitlan via one of the dams. This siege strategy was systematic and brutal. The Spaniards advanced meter by meter, facing fierce resistance from the Aztecs. The pressure on the Aztecs grew with each passing day, and the city gradually turned into ruins. Cuauhtémoc, the new Tlatoani, understood the scale of the threat and organized the defense of the causeways. The Aztecs had numerical superiority and knowledge of the terrain. They used the causeways as traps, destroying them and forcing the Spaniards to fight for every meter. This struggle on the causeways was bloody and exhausting. The Spaniards, attempting to break into the city, encountered the Aztecs' unique tactics. The Aztecs destroyed the dams, creating obstacles for the Spanish cavalry. The Spaniards were forced to fill in these gaps to advance further. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a war of attrition. The siege of Tenochtitlan was not merely a war, it was a clash of 2 military systems. The Spanish used their cannons and arquebuses, inflicting heavy casualties on the Aztecs. But the Aztecs, using their knowledge of the terrain, attacked the Spanish from canoes. The battle on Lake Texcoco was critical. Spanish brigantines controlling the lake deprived the Aztecs of the ability to receive food and aid. Cortés, seeing that the Aztecs would not surrender, made a brutal strategic decision. He ordered the destruction of every quarter of Tenochtitlan, filling in the canals and reducing the island to ruins. This decision changed the nature of the war. The Spaniards ceased to be mere conquerors. They became destroyers. Tenochtitlan, once a majestic city, gradually vanished from the face of the earth. In the city caught in the grip of the siege, a smallpox epidemic broke out. This disease, brought by the Spaniards, became an invisible killer, wiping out thousands of people. The pressure on the Aztecs became unbearable. The city's leader, Cuauhtémoc, was forced to continue the fight, but his power was waning with each passing day. The situation in Tenochtitlan was catastrophic. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted more than 2 months. The Spaniards advanced toward the city center, meter by meter. The Aztecs, trapped in a confined space, were forced to fight to the last. The city's leader, Cuauhtémoc, was forced to watch the destruction of his capital, but he did not give up. Tenochtitlan, once a majestic city, was reduced to ruins. Cortés, seeing the scale of the losses, realized that victory would be a bitter one. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal and destructive in human history. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth, and the once fearsome people were conquered by a handful of outsiders. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards but also their Native American allies, who used this event to achieve their own goals. But the long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. What if everything you believed is a lie, and the Aztec Empire was not destroyed by Spanish cannons, but by an invisible killer that they brought with them? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. It's not a prophecy, but the biology of the siege. The smallpox epidemic that broke out in Tenochtitlan during the siege of 1521 was a catastrophe that paralyzed the Aztec system of government. This disease, brought by one of the Spanish soldiers, spread through the city at lightning speed. Tenochtitlan, once a majestic city, turned into a mass grave. The pressure on the Aztecs was becoming unbearable, and not just because of Cortés's siege. Smallpox was killing people by the thousands, sparing neither the rich nor the poor. Chaos broke out in the city, and the system of government began to collapse. Cuauhtémoc, the new Tlatoani, was forced to fight not only an external enemy, but also an invisible killer. Control over the situation was completely lost. The smallpox epidemic did not merely weaken the Aztecs, it completely destroyed their will to resist. People were paralyzed by fear and disease. Famine set in as there was no one left to grow food. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth, and the once fearsome people were conquered by a handful of outsiders. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies, who used this event to achieve their own goals. But the long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all involved. Cuauhtémoc, lacking resources, continued to fight, but his vulnerability was evident. Smallpox spared neither his family nor his entourage. The empire's administrative system was completely destroyed, and the city of Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth. The Spaniards, though they too suffered from the disease, were more resistant to it than the Aztecs. This strategic advantage of the Spaniards became one of the decisive factors in their victory. Smallpox was not merely a disease, it was a strategic weapon of Cortés, who used it to achieve his goals. He did not simply destroy the city, he destroyed its inhabitants. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once formidable people were subjugated by a handful of outsiders. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal and destructive in human history. Cuauhtémoc, trapped in a confined space, was forced to watch the destruction of his capital. Smallpox had wiped out all his experienced military leaders and advisors. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a war not for life, but for death. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once fearsome people were subjugated by a handful of invaders. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. As the Spaniards advanced meter by meter toward the center of Tenochtitlan, Cuauhtémoc decided to move his command post to Tlatelolco, the northern part of the island. Tlatelolco, once an independent city, was famous for its colossal market, but now it had become the last stronghold of the defense. The siege of Tenochtitlan was approaching its inevitable and bloody conclusion. Cortés's ambitions were close to being realized, but the surviving defenders were completely vulnerable. Hunger and despair reigned in the city, trapped in the grip of the siege. Cortés, realizing that the end was near, continued his strategy of destruction. The Spaniards razed the neighborhoods of Tlatelolco, advancing toward the Aztecs' final defensive line. The Aztecs, trapped in a confined space, were forced to fight for every meter. The pressure on Cuauhtémoc was unbearable. His power was waning by the hour. Control over the situation in Tlatelolco had been completely lost. Cuauhtémoc, lacking resources, continued to fight, but his vulnerability was obvious. Cuauhtémoc, trapped in Tlatelolco, was forced to watch the destruction of his capital. Meter by meter, the Spaniards advanced toward the center of Tlatelolco, where the last Aztec defenders were hiding. The pressure on the Aztecs grew with each passing day. Hunger and disease were destroying their will to resist. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies, who used this event to achieve their own goals. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most devastating in human history. The Aztecs, trapped in Tlatelolco, continued to resist fiercely. They used the narrow streets and canals to set up ambushes for the Spaniards. Control of the situation was fragile, and Cortés was forced to advance with great caution. Famine set in within the city, becoming yet another invisible killer. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal and destructive in human history. Cuauhtémoc, seeing that the Aztecs would not surrender, made a brutal strategic decision. He ordered the destruction of every quarter of Tlatelolco, filling in the canals and turning the island into ruins. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies, who used this event to achieve their own goals. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal and destructive in human history. By August 13, 1521, after 93 days of a brutal siege, the Aztec resistance was finally broken. The city of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, and hundreds of thousands of inhabitants had perished from starvation, disease, and Spanish weapons. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies. Cuauhtémoc, the great Tlatoani, was forced to watch the destruction of his capital, confined to Tlatelolco, the northern part of the island. The pressure on Cuauhtémoc was unbearable. He decided to surrender to Cortés. Cortés' strategic decision was risky, but it paralyzed the Aztec administrative system. Cortés declared Moctezuma a hostage, but allowed him to continue governing the state, albeit now under Spanish control. However, Cuauhtémoc, lacking resources, continued to fight, though his vulnerability was evident. Famine struck the city of Tenochtitlan, and a smallpox epidemic was killing people by the thousands. Cuauhtémoc, the great Tlatoani, was forced to watch the destruction of his capital. Cuauhtémoc, trapped in a confined space, made the strategic decision to surrender in order to save the surviving inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a war not for life, but for death. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once fearsome people were subjugated by a handful of invaders. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most devastating in the history of Mesoamerica. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies. Cuauhtémoc, lacking resources, continued to fight, but his vulnerability was obvious. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. Smallpox had wiped out all of Cuauhtémoc's experienced military leaders and advisors. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once fearsome people were subjugated by a handful of outsiders. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all involved. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies, who used this event to achieve their own goals. I will reveal the best-kept secret. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not merely a military victory for the Spaniards, but a colossal humanitarian catastrophe. In August 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan, once majestic, was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once formidable people were conquered by a handful of outsiders. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most devastating in the history of Mesoamerica. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their indigenous allies. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. After Cuauhtémoc's surrender, the Spaniards began the systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan. They demolished temples and palaces, filling in canals and dams, turning the island into ruins. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a war not for life, but for death. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, and the once fearsome people had been subjugated by a handful of outsiders. Cortés, seeing the scale of the losses, realized that victory would be a bitter one. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their indigenous allies. Cortés' ambitions were realized, but his vulnerability was evident. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal and destructive in human history. Famine struck the city, and a smallpox epidemic was killing people by the thousands. Cuauhtémoc, the great Tlatoani, was forced to watch the destruction of his capital. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies who used this event to achieve their own goals. The siege of Tenochtitlan was one of the most brutal and destructive in human history. Famine struck the city, and a smallpox epidemic was killing people by the thousands. Cuauhtémoc, seeing the scale of the destruction, realized that Cortés's victory would be a bitter one. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most devastating in human history. The Aztecs, trapped in Tenochtitlan, continued to resist fiercely. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their Native American allies. Cortés, seeing the scale of the losses, realized that victory would be a bitter one. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once fearsome people were subjugated by a handful of outsiders. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 did more than just weaken the Aztecs. It completely destroyed their will to resist. After Cortés's siege, Tenochtitlan was razed to the ground, meter by meter, and the once fearsome people were subjugated by a handful of outsiders. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal in human history. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their indigenous allies, who used this event to achieve their own goals. But the long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. On the ruins of Tenochtitlan, Cortés began construction of a new city, Mexico City. This strategic decision by Cortés to make Mexico City the capital of New Spain became his most significant strategic move. In Tenochtitlan, once the majestic city of Mesoamerica, Cortés saw not only wealth but also a strategic trap. Famine had set in, and a smallpox epidemic was killing people by the thousands. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all involved. The victors in this war were not only the Spaniards, but also their indigenous allies who used this event to achieve their own goals. Control over Mexico City gave Cortés power over all of Mesoamerica. The siege of Tenochtitlan became one of the most brutal in human history. After Cuauhtémoc's surrender, the Spaniards began the systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan. Cortés filled in the canals and dams, turning the island into ruins. The fall of Tenochtitlan and the founding of Mexico City marked the beginning of a long and brutal history of the colonization of Mesoamerica. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a war of attrition. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. The Spaniards, using their numerical superiority and knowledge of the terrain, attacked the Aztecs from canoes. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a war not for survival, but for life and death. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all involved. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth meter by meter, and the once fearsome people were conquered by a handful of outsiders. Tenochtitlan was wiped off the face of the earth, and the once fearsome people were conquered by a handful of outsiders. We conclude our exploration of the 1521 siege of Tenochtitlan. Behind each of Cortés's innovations, from the brigantines to the complete destruction of Tenochtitlan, lies an unyielding will to survive. These stories show that the human spirit is capable of adapting to any conditions, even the most unimaginable ones. The siege of Tenochtitlan is a tragedy that lays bare the worst aspects of humanity, but it also sometimes reveals the best. Mutual aid, ingenuity, and incredible resilience. The long-term consequences of the siege were catastrophic for all those involved. Suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you'd like to see on our channel. What would you like to learn? The history of the founding of colonial Mexico City, or details of Moctezuma II's life before the arrival of the Spanish? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new explorations of the military strategies of Mesoamerica's past.